Welcome to Feast from the East and our dinner table discussion with two experts on Soviet cinema. So we have Elisa Timoshkina, who some of you will have met in the cooking class, who is a Siberia-born, London-bred chef, food writer and historian with proud Ukrainian heritage, and a co-founder of Cook for Ukraine, a campaign which has raised 1.3 million and counting for UNICEF. She holds a PhD in Soviet Holocaust cinema and launched the acclaimed cinema club Kinovino. And on my left I have Dr. Rory Finnin, who is a professor of Ukrainian studies at the University of Cambridge and leading expert on the history, politics, culture and cinema of Ukraine, and he's also a trustee of the Ukrainian Institute London. So I wanted to just jump in straight away with dates and timeline, because the oldest of the films in the programme are now actually almost a century old. So why do you think so many of them endure as classics? And especially in the case of Earth and Bread, how do you view or interpret them in today's context? Both broadly, as in today in the 21st century, and today very specifically in the context of the war in Ukraine.
Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to. The two films are, I think, really emblematic of a fascinating period in Soviet Ukrainian culture of the 1920s, and they mark this really pivotal turning point, 1929, 1930, in which so many things change culturally. When the really vibrant film studio Vuvku, the Vse-Ukrainske Fotokino Upravlenie, or the All-Ukrainian Photo Film Administration, when it is effectively closed down and subsumed within the broader Soviet film industrial apparatus. So there's something really remarkable about them, showcasing the end of these halcyon days of Soviet art, we might say, of the 1920s, and then particularly Ukrainian art in the Soviet context. That is, this was Soviet art that allowed Ukrainian national culture to breathe on film within limits. And then we have this really quizzical censorship of bread, of chleb, that prevents it from really being seen by many audiences, whereas Earth, Zemlya, at least has a showing in Kiev for a number of days before it's pulled from screen. So there's something really pivotal there. And then obviously in the tragic and horrific circumstances we're in right now, these are films that showcase the way in which the Soviet regime, through collectivization, was seeking to control the distribution and harvesting of grain, and then also the way in which that control also mapped onto a control of culture, particularly national culture. So sadly very resonant, as we see right now, Russian forces in the Kremlin attempting to seize grain, sell it on the international market illegally, taking it from Ukrainian farmers, and potentially provoking starvation around the world. So that I think makes these films very timely, but then they're also really, I think, wonderfully emblematic if we can compartmentalize the war from this cultural effervescence of the 1920s, also really emblematic of this explosion of creativity that then meets an end in the 1930s.
And what about for you? Kind of, how do they land for you now, these films?
It was really fascinating to review the films. Last time I watched them, I was still an undergraduate student myself. And the two things that struck me the most was the artistic value of the work, and as you say, they're almost 100 years old, but the sheer innovation and the sheer freshness of the images is just mind-blowing, and to think that that was done with very primitive technological equipment, and also how how sophisticated new viewers had to be to appreciate them. And of course, as we know, sadly those films didn't really have a career at their time, but still the fact that they were made then, it's really astonishing to kind of just appreciate that artistic and technological sophistication. But the other thing that really moved me was particularly in connection to chleb, is that scene where one of the elderly peasants, he is bowing to the harvest, And where they're saying it's not gonna grow because it was stolen and it's stolen land, but then it does. And there's that beauty of nature and that reverence towards nature. And to be honest, it actually moved me to tears. Just as a scene in itself, but also, of course, understanding it in the contemporary context of what is happening in Ukraine right now and what was about to happen in Ukraine on the verge. We're talking 1930, and just realizing that actually, how much suffering has that beautiful fertile land experienced. So that scene to me really was one of the most powerful things I've ever seen, actually, which was quite fascinating, that a film from the 1930s, and these days we're oversaturated with moving images, to have such a powerful response was quite incredible, really.
And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about kind of film and food, very much as kind of as cultural, almost objects that kind of include kind of ownership. Because both film and food are fought over and contested in terms of national ownership. Parajanov in particular, a strong example of this, he's claimed as Georgian, as Armenian, everyone wants a slice of him, Do you think directors or dishes can or should be attributed to countries?
I think so if they self-identify in a particular way, and if we understand identities as something that can overlap, not mutually exclusive conditions of human existence. All of us have different identities at different times of the day. So I think if a filmmaker or artist is coming out of a particular tradition and signaling the influence of that tradition, what makes Parajanov so fascinating is he's signaling his indebtedness to almost every tradition, Georgian, Armenian, Ukrainian. This is someone, as you say, an Armenian born in Georgia who is jailed for Ukrainian nationalism. So I think it's about recognizing cultural diversity above all, and recognizing the way artists are always connecting with works of the past so as to gesture to new possibilities in the future. So I think so.
What about your and maybe more as well about food, I guess, and dishes, kind of borscht, vareniki, but maybe everyone will claim rights to them.
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject that doesn't stop to fascinate me ever. I guess on the one hand, kind of going back to film and culture more broadly, as we know, nationality is a constructed entity, and whichever way it happens, whether through kind of state-sponsored programs or a more organic way, there's a sense of constructedness around it. So, of course, on the one hand, it's really important to kind of understand that, and not in a way to say that, yes, this film or this work of art or this dish is specific to that place, but to see its role in creating that sense of specificity and that sense of belonging to a place. But of course, I completely agree with Rory that, identities are so fluid, and, when it comes to national identity and our own national or ethnic heritage, it's so intertwined, it's so complex, that it's very hard to draw a clear line, and, should we even try? I'm kind of more to, championing the idea of fluidity and kind of accepting the complexity and the non-linearity of your own experience and of your own identity. But, when it comes to food, and perhaps specifically in the context of Ukrainian history and culture, food is such a strong language with which people were able to preserve and write their histories. And specifically in the context of when your actual language was banned and other perhaps more kind of obvious or more apparent expressions of national identity were strictly controlled, then food became this kind of clandestine, more non-verbal means of telling your story, of preserving it and of passing it on. So I completely respect and appreciate that there are certain ways of looking at food where we do have to give the respect of saying, yes, this is a national dish or this is a regional dish or a particular area. But of course, at the same time, that doesn't mean that other people cannot take part in that story and not appreciate it, because gastronomically speaking, those dishes are just fantastic. And, even if we don't have that same immediate kind of visceral ancestral connection to it, that does not mean that we can't enjoy them and cannot celebrate them. And if we talk about borscht, then I
won't dare tap into borscht
program about that.
For safety, I won't. But I guess off the back of that, in terms of regional dishes and things and national dishes, do you think there can be or should be something like national cinema? We talk about maybe kind of Iberian cinema or Russian cinema, or Soviet cinema as a really broad umbrella term. And you kind of tapped into this, but how do you think those lines are commonly drawn in terms of, is it where the film is made? Is it the country the director identifies as being from? How can we define national cinemas? Because that language is used a lot, seasons and programs about particular national cinemas. How are those lines drawn? Because surely it's, as with food, it's quite porous.
Yeah, food, like culture, is meant to connect us, and that kind of connection doesn't stop at a national border. Often the most wonderful engagements around culture and food is when we're crossing those borders all the time. I love sitting, and I've learned a great deal, been humbled very often around the Ukrainian table in particular, in that dance of saying I'm too full, and then someone offering more food, and it keeps going on like this for the entire evening, and somehow we always find more room for food, and somehow there's always more food to be had. So I think my own personal individual growth has come out of those moments of cultural culinary exchange across borders. So it's important that we don't, again, think of these as mutually exclusive boundaries, but at the same time, this is where we need to think more in this both and fashion, right? Where we can say that there is a tradition here that's being referenced and being embodied and ingested even, and at the same time that it's constantly open to new possibilities of connection. So I think with film, it is complicated because you have the commercial side, the actual manufacturing of the film, which can take place with different agents, studios across various borders. But obviously the content of the film, above all, if it's depicting, let's say, life in Ukraine, it's a Ukrainian film. One of the fascinating films of the late 1920s in Ukraine is a Crimean Tatar film that was considered the first Crimean Tatar film by Crimean Tatar intellectuals, called Alim, but it was made by this wonderful Vuvku studio. So it was funded by monies from Soviet Ukraine, but it was very much a Crimean Tatar film. So you can see how that film is both Ukrainian and also Crimean Tatar. So I think it's important that we think of things in that way of being both and. The problem that we have here in the UK in particular has been this conflation of Russian and Soviet. In 2011, the British Film Institute actually was very guilty of this. They had a wonderful program of Soviet film that they advertised as Russian film pioneers. And so they had Parajanov, they had Dovzhenko, they had Vertov, etc. Not mentioning that Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera was produced by Vuvku after being refused by Russian studios. So that is a problem we have to solve, because there you can see not that both and logic, but an either or. And that either or logic leads to these moments of exclusion where particularly smaller groups, whether they be national or not, are left out of the picture. And that's something that I think is a perennial problem.
Something that I came across a lot in researching this program is each director being described with so many different nationalities. Dovzhenko being referred to as Russian, Parajanov being referred to as everything under the sun, and I came up against this quite a lot, and you kind of really have to try not to get frustrated by it, because this is kind of a whole process of I think decolonialization is the right and appropriate word here that needs to happen, and I think that's, for the case for the Soviet Union, I really think that's only just starting that conversation, personally.
Oh, completely. And I think, to me, coming from Russia with Ukrainian heritage, but having lived for over 20 years here, I found myself guilty of having that colonialist mentality and thinking of specifically of culture through the lens of kind of Soviet/Russian kind of identity. Growing up watching films, kind of just by default assume them to be Russian because primarily linguistically they are Russian. But then of course we get into a more complex and kind of nuanced territory of the Soviet concept. As Rory said, there's a question of self-identification of the director or an artist did espouse Soviet values and did create work with kind of the Soviet ethos in it, then of course, by all means, that work can be understood as Soviet, but more often than not, if we're talking about Dovzhenko or someone like Grossman, they then have suffered significantly at the hands of the very regime that they have initially supported. So, is that ethically correct to still call them Soviet, kind of retrospectively understanding the trajectory of their creative life and their personal life? I find it's a really problematic subject, and I think it's okay to say that perhaps we don't have the answers yet, but as Rory said, it's so important to start this work of peeling away those layers and at least just understand and acknowledge the fact that we do have this very problematic umbrella understanding of Soviet culture, and it is time to start teasing out kind of the nuances and in general, I find it's quite an unhelpful concept to talk about art solely in national terms. And in the sphere of film, for example, in film festivals, the BFI for a very long time categorized their films in national terms. So whenever you look through the program, you expect to see countries. Whereas I think about 10 years ago, maybe less, they've switched their approach and now they look at genre and themes. And, in production of films, it's, it's such a complex, the way they're financed, the way the films are made, and you can't really draw a line anymore. So kind of living in a global world, I think it's quite healthy to move past the national label and, kind of really starting to embrace the complexity and the nuanced way in which art and food are produced and consumed.
If I may just play devil's advocate to that, because I completely agree. But for example, in leading institutions like, for example, the Dovzhenko Center in Kiev are a seminal space where Ukrainian cinema, quite specifically, is celebrated and kept and preserved. And that very much, I think, is framed in quite a national context, but that's also, arguably, that has its value too, in that's cultural national preservation, something that is being quite directly attacked right now. So countering that with a body, a building that houses a whole body of work is actually quite valuable in that context, potentially.
Absolutely, I think that's why the both and logic is really key, because Dovzhenko Center has been magnificent in restoring so many different films to view, being active, finding films like Khlib, which was actually in the archives in Russia, and only then shown in 2013. So we absolutely have to celebrate that national content, that national legacy, at the same time just not confine it to it, because that is reducing this vibrant, diverse art to these really simplistic calculations. And I do think that we've been studying Ukraine, I would say the Soviet Union, Russia as well, with arithmetic when we need something more like calculus or at least algebra, so that we can bring on board the coexistence of the nation and the Soviet. And someone like Dovzhenko is a great example. I mean, he's someone who fought on the side of the Ukrainian People's Republic against Bolsheviks, but then eventually becomes, a favorite filmmaker of Stalin. So, if we play according to this either-or logic, we can't accept his Soviet activity. We have to always read, for instance, any moment in which he actually ascribed some positivity to Soviet ideology as false or not real, and that's not true. And at the same time, as we've seen in the study of Soviet film, that Ukrainian legacy and future that he saw, because for Dovzhenko and people like Dovzhenko and Shpykovsky in particular, they saw a life for Ukraine within the Soviet system. That promise was betrayed by Stalin, but they still felt it. And so if we, again, reduce it to one or the other, if we push out the national in favor of the Soviet, as has been done in Western scholarship for way too long, but if conversely we just push out the Soviet completely, we're failing to see that complexity, that rich diversity, and that would be an artistic, intellectual failing.
I mean, off the back of that, we tapped into censorship, and all three of the films in the programme were made in the context of pretty fierce censorship. Do you think censorship is only ever a limitation, or can it actually be a springboard for more creative ways of getting across ideas? In the same way that you've said, food as an unspoken language, can censorship in film actually achieve that, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, as Lars von Trier famously did, create his own obstructions to prove that art needs some form of obstruction in order to, become the real genuine kind of version of itself. So paradoxically, yes, and there's always been a debate in context of post-Soviet cinema, suddenly that freedom, has it actually impacted the artistic quality, or has now the financial limitations become the equivalents of the Soviet censorship? So there's always been this understanding of a very kind of intricate relationship between censorship and the artistic value of the work produced in the system. So I'd say yes, not in a way to say censorship is great, and of course there were so many directors who have suffered greatly, and so many films that haven't had the chance to see its audience. So in that sense, I believe that censorship has impoverished Soviet, again for the lack of better term, film history, but at the same time it also speaks about the creative power of a director and his or her ability to overcome that censorship and still preserve their vision. So in a way, it can tease out the real talent even further, and in that sense it definitely can be seen as a kind of healthy obstruction that enables a great work to flourish, but of course kind of understanding the real context and the real costs that so many directors had to pay to get their films made, there's no way that we can talk about censorship in any positive light.
I would simply say there's a difference between regulating and managing film and film content, film circulation, and then there's censorship, which usually in our understanding of the term means an aggressive restriction of speech and creativity. So in that sense, I think it is usually just a force curtailing creative expression, and then there's the danger of internal censorship, which is a really prominent theme in Soviet and Soviet Ukrainian culture of the 20th century. This idea that these regimes that place guardrails but also police them with discipline and with state force and violence can infect all of us in various individual ways that then we consume and then we process. We become our own censors. So I do think that then puts a chill in society, and we could say that in contemporary Russia right now, with so many actually supporting the war, that there's this ability of all of us to eventually, in these systems of restricted speech, we begin to mimic the state in small individual personal ways, and it's very hard to climb out of that hole. So I think, managing, regulating as best we can according to laws in society, but still leaving, the artistic text open to play and diverse interpretation. That's the balance it's hard to strike.
And to kind of tap into and continue the conversation about decolonializing the Soviet cinema space, I guess it's important to remember that film, especially the films we're talking about, are material. They're on celluloid, they're negatives, and very much a cultural artifact that exists and is kept in a physical space. So, bread was only rediscovered in the 70s, and many Ukrainian films are still being searched for, and we don't know where they are, and we only hope they'll be found. So what are your thoughts on, I guess, perhaps the repatriation of film negatives, for example? Is that something you think needs to take place?
I think it's a really beautiful symbolic gesture, and as we were talking before, in the context of Ukraine specifically, despite the fact that nationalism and national label is a problematic one, it's also important to remember that when applied with respect and knowledge and understanding of the context, it's a very useful tool for understanding, not just for the outsiders to understand, but also for the people within the country to be able to embrace and understand and make peace with their past and their current identity. So I think that's definitely that kind of gesture of returning the films to the place of their origin. It has a really beautiful symbolic role, but also a very tangible, very specific role to play in terms of the process of healing and the process of ownership and reclaiming what has been taken away from the country and from the nation. So, film is a popular art, so it probably is one of the most powerful ways in which Ukraine can have its sense of self reinstalled.
Really well said. I would just add that we often think of the interventions of the state in culture as somehow oppressive, or at least our first instinct is to think that that's the case. And here I think in recovering these films, for instance, the role of the state and state agencies are really key, because really what's the commercial incentive for a studio to be chasing down films on a whim? It's really hard to, let's say there's a profit motive there, but having a state actually and a state film agency seeking to do so is another matter, and they've been really active in Ukraine finding works, looking for works. I was working with the Dovzhenko Center on finding posters of the films produced by Vuvku in places inside Ukraine, in different archives in Ukraine. So there's a lot to do. I do think that the state has been really, important in that respect, and it has begun to create the kinds of contexts and circumstances needed for the evolution of Ukrainian language cinema too, kind of a multilingual cinema. There, I think the state has been really useful, but as all the things we're discussing right now, it requires a delicate balance where you can be true to the diverse lived reality of people in your country, and at the same time seek to promote the use of Ukrainian language, which, due to commercial reasons, was never really embraced by filmmakers in the post-Soviet context. So that's a big change that I think the Ukrainian state has been very active in and should be applauded for. But as always, there needs to be constant review of how far are we going with quotas, how far are we going in restricting various things. That's a tricky issue, but I do think the state has been really key, and finding those texts and those films has been a remarkable thing. Truly exciting adventure, really finding them.
And to end on a potentially divisive question, of the 3 films in the program, personally, which would be your favourite for both of you?
Wow. For me, not divisive, but I'm sure. For me, it's Zemlya. I find that to be a film that constantly surprises me, perplexes me, provokes me. Without question, all of them are magnificent works. And the discovery of Khliv in particular, I think, is something we should all celebrate, because it's a fairly recent revelation, that film, and magnificently done and wonderfully restored as well. The picture clarity, the motion clarity is magnificent. But Zemlya is perplexing in this way that I find year in, year out, particularly at Cambridge, students and I grapple with. This is a film that is so paradoxical in so many ways, a film about collectivization that we often think of as this harbinger of the famine of 1932-33, but yet showcases a Ukrainian countryside that is full of absolute abundance of nature. And that's a really fascinating choice on Dovzhenko's part, because if we look at works by Eisenstein, by Shpykovsky, and Khleib as well, there's a concerted effort to showcase the poverty of the Ukrainian countryside. And in Dovzhenko's film, we don't see that at all. I mean, the Ukrainian countryside is overflowing with apples and pumpkins, and there's no shortage of food. And that's a very fascinating political message that I think we often don't unpack enough when we look at the films promoting collectivization and the reason why the Soviet regime pushed it so much. So for the Soviet regime, it was about the poverty and the backwardness of the countryside, but Dovzhenko shows us something quite the opposite. So those moments, one of thousands in that film, make it the best of the bunch, in my opinion.
That's so wonderful to hear, because as we were saying earlier, I actually struggled with the film when I had to rewatch it before our conversation today. So it's really fascinating to hear you say that, and I'm glad we got the chance to touch upon that. And I found myself going through motions as I was watching the film. There were moments of absolute, almost divine beauty in it, where I could feel like, yeah, that's the hand of the great Dovzhenko, and others I really could not understand what was happening, and I felt, it's kind of ideologically problematic, and but at the same time I was also aware of the fact that that is precisely what makes this film so special, and that's why this film continues to be studied and continues to be written about. There's something in it that will grasp you for whichever reason, but it's definitely a film that doesn't leave you kind of disinterested and doesn't just, you forget about it tomorrow. It's definitely not one of those films. I think Khleib was something that really moved me, and let's be honest, 1920s cinema obviously is a very specific language, cinematically speaking, so it's not something that we sit down with a cup of tea to enjoy. It's a complex experience, but that film felt like a really kind of almost soothing process. I really kind of went on a journey with it. So it was a pure kind of cinematic experience. I'd say Khleib was something that I genuinely enjoyed and was quite surprised by that as well. But also I love Parajanov. I feel like he's my soulmate. I just, as a person, of course I don't know him personally, but having read so much about him, having met people who worked with him, I'm in love with him as this vibrant personality. And of course his art is just insanely unique and daring, and it's just brilliant. So Parajanov always has a very special place in my heart in any discussion of film. So he just, that's a given, but I think it's just such a beautifully put together program that really, taps into different ways of, different ways in which we relate to film, and different ways in which film can talk to us as well. So
both Parajanov and Dovzhenko showcase the consumption of food is this really sensual, almost erotic experience. I mean, think about the beginning of Zemunah with the death scene, probably the best death ever filmed, in which the grandfather quietly, peacefully passes away with his friends and family around him, but he eats this piece of fruit with such joy, and what a way to start a film. In Parajanov, you can see, I like to imagine Parajanov waiting and focusing on that scene, and taking from it that almost sensuous experience of eating on film. It's a great connection between the two of them.
Well, thank you both very much. I'll call it a day because otherwise we could sit at this table all day. But thank you very much, both of you, for your time and for expanding on the programme and all the films in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.